Jack Reacher didn't believe in coincidences, but he did believe in buses. They were anonymous, reliable, and always heading somewhere else. That was enough. This one was wheezing its way through the sparse, windswept plains of Wyoming, depositing him in a town called Harmony Creek. The name was a lie. There was no harmony, and the creek looked more like a muddy scar on the land. Reacher had no reason to be there, except for a vague memory of an old army buddy, Frank Peterson, mentioning he'd settled in a place with a similarly ironic name. It was a long shot, a 1 in 1,000 chance, but Reacher had time. He had nothing but time. He stepped off the bus into a blast of dry, cool air. The town was small, a single main street with a handful of storefronts that looked tired and worn. A diner, a hardware store, a sheriff's office, and a bar. Standard issue. As he walked, his size drew glances. At 6'5", with a build that spoke of a life of hard use, he didn't blend in. People watched him from behind dusty windows, their gazes lingering just a little too long. It was the kind of watchfulness that wasn't curiosity. It was caution. This town had secrets, and it didn't like strangers. He found the diner. The bell over the door gave a weak jingle. A young woman with weary eyes and a name tag that read Sarah looked up from wiping the counter. "Just coffee," Reacher said, taking a stool at the counter. She nodded, pouring a cup of dark, bitter-smelling liquid. "Passing through?" "Something like that," Reacher said. "Looking for a man. Frank Peterson, Army vet. Used to know him." Sarah's hand hesitated for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of something, fear, maybe sorrow, flashing across her face before being replaced by a professional blankness. "Don't know him," she said, her voice a little too flat. "Big guy, about my height but friendlier looking. Laughs a lot," Reacher pressed gently. "Lots of people pass through," she replied, turning away to wipe a non-existent spot on the coffee machine. Reacher drank his coffee. It was as bad as it smelled. He knew she was lying. In a town this small, a man like Frank would be known. Her lie was a warning sign, a bright red flag fluttering in the desolate landscape of Harmony Creek. He finished the cup, left a few dollars on the counter, and walked out. The sun was higher now, but it offered no warmth. His next stop was the sheriff's office. It was a small brick building with a single squad car parked out front. Inside, a man sat behind a large wooden desk. He had a thick neck, a gut that strained the buttons of his uniform, and a nameplate that read, Sheriff Brody. He was looking at Reacher with the same cautious appraisal as everyone else. "Can I help you?" Brody asked. His voice was a low rumble, meant to be intimidating. "Looking for an old friend," Reacher said, repeating his query. "Frank Peterson." Sheriff Brody leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He steepled his fingers over his stomach. "Frank's dead." The words landed in the quiet office with a thud. Reacher felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He hadn't seen Frank in over a decade, but the man had been a rock, one of the few genuinely good soldiers he'd ever served with. "How?" Reacher asked, his voice steady. "Hunting accident," Brody said, a little too quickly. 2 weeks ago. Went out into the hills, tripped, and fell. Tragic." Reacher stood perfectly still, processing the information. Frank Peterson wasn't the kind of man to have a hunting accident. He was a former ranger, an expert marksman, and one of the most sure-footed men Reacher had ever known. Tripping wasn't in his vocabulary. "Where is he buried?" Brody waved a dismissive hand. "Cemetery on the east side of town. But I'm telling you, the case is closed. It was an accident. Nothing to see here." "I'll be the judge of that," Reacher said. Brody's eyes narrowed. "Look, friend, you're a big guy, I get it. You're used to getting your way, but this is my town. I'd appreciate it if you'd drink your coffee, get back on that bus, and forget you were ever here." "He was my friend," Reacher said, the words coming out colder than he intended. "And now he's a memory," Brody countered. "Keep it that way." Reacher left the office. The warning was clear. The sheriff wanted him gone. The waitress was scared to even say Frank's name. This wasn't grief. It was fear. The whole town was suffocating in it. The story of a hunting accident didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a poorly constructed lie, a story concocted for strangers. He found the cemetery. It was a windswept patch of ground dotted with weathered headstones. Frank's grave was fresh, the mound of dirt still dark and unsettled. The marker was simple, almost temporary. Frank Peterson, a good man. Reacher stood over the grave, the wind whipping at his jacket. It didn't feel right. There were no flowers, no signs of visitors. It was the grave of a man they wanted to forget. He walked the perimeter of the gravesite. The ground was hard and dry. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just an inconsistency, something that didn't fit the sheriff's neat little story. And then he saw it. A faint scuff mark in the dirt near a cluster of rocks, a few yards from the grave. It was the mark of a boot heel, dragged, not stepped. And beside it, a small, glinting object half buried in the soil. He knelt down, his large frame hiding his movements. He dug it out with his fingers. It was a piece of metal, a small brass pin shaped like an eagle's claw. It was a tie tack. Frank Peterson never wore a tie in his life. He wore flannel shirts and work boots, but Reacher knew who did. The pin was the insignia of the Caldwell Corporation, a massive private security firm that had a reputation for being as ruthless as it was efficient. Their headquarters, he recalled from a news article years ago, was a sprawling, fortified compound somewhere in rural Wyoming. Suddenly, a lot of things started to make a dark kind of sense. He had seen the same insignia on a billboard on the way into town, Caldwell Security, keeping Harmony Creek safe. It seemed they owned the town, and probably the sheriff too, and Frank somehow had gotten tangled up with them. Reacher went back to the main street. He needed a place to stay and a place to think. The only lodging was a rundown motel at the edge of town called the Creekside Inn. The clerk gave him a room without a word, taking his cash and sliding a key across the counter. The room was small and smelled of stale smoke and disinfectant. Reacher didn't care. He sat on the lumpy bed and looked at the small brass pin in his palm. Frank hadn't tripped. He'd been brought here. The scuff mark was from his body being dragged. They killed him and then buried him, feeding the town a convenient lie. The question was why. That evening, he went to the town's only bar. It was called the Watering Hole. A few men sat scattered at tables, nursing beers and speaking in low tones. Reacher took a seat at the far end of the bar. He ordered a beer and listened. The talk was idle, the weather, the price of feed, but underneath it was a current of unease. Any mention of the Caldwells brought a swift change of subject. They were the ghosts at the feast, their name unspoken, but their presence felt in every corner of the room. After about an hour, two men walked in. They were big, but not in the way Reacher was. Their bulk was from the gym, not from a life of labor. They wore matching black jackets with the same eagle claw insignia on the chest. Caldwell Security. They scanned the room, and their eyes locked onto Reacher. They walked over, their boots thudding on the wooden floor. "You're new," the first one said. He had a shaved head and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "Not for long," Reacher replied, not looking at them. "The sheriff said you were asking questions about Frank Peterson," the second one said. He was leaner, with cold, watchful eyes. "He was my friend," Reacher said simply. "He was an employee," Scarborough corrected him. "And he had an accident. Sometimes people should leave accidents alone." "Sometimes accidents aren't accidents," Reacher said, finally turning to face them. He looked from one to the other, his gaze flat and unreadable. "And sometimes people who deliver messages get the reply." The tension in the bar ratcheted up. The few other patrons suddenly found their drinks fascinating, or the floor or the ceiling, anywhere but the confrontation brewing at the bar. Scarborough smirked. "That a threat?" "It's a fact," Reacher said. "Here's another one. You're going to turn around and walk out of here. You're going to go back to your boss and tell him a friend of Frank's is in town, and you're going to tell him that friend isn't leaving until he gets the truth." The two men exchanged a look. The smirk on Scarborough's face turned into a snarl. "I don't think so." He threw a punch. It was fast, aimed for Reacher's jaw. but Reacher had been expecting it. He moved his head an inch, the punch whistling past his ear. In the same motion, his right hand came up, not in a fist, but open. He struck Scarborough in the throat with the edge of his hand. It was a precise, devastating blow. The man gagged, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and staggered backward, clutching his neck. The second man lunged, pulling something from his jacket. Reacher didn't wait to see what it was. He kicked out, his heavy boot connecting squarely with the man's knee. There was a sickening crunch. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed to the floor, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Reacher stood up. The entire encounter had taken less than 5 seconds. The bar was dead silent except for the gasping of one man and the whimpering of the other. Reacher looked at the bartender, who was frozen behind the counter, his face pale. "Put their drinks on my tab," Reacher said. He walked out of the bar and into the cool night air. The message had been delivered, and a reply had been sent. This was just the beginning. Frank Peterson deserved justice, and Reacher was going to tear Harmony Creek apart to get it. The next morning, Reacher woke early. The events of the previous night would have reached Elias Caldwell by now. Reacher wasn't waiting for the next move, he was making his own. He needed information, and he knew the only person who might be willing, however reluctantly, to give it to him was the waitress, Sarah. Fear could be a prison, but sometimes a flicker of hope could pick the lock. He walked back to the diner. It was just opening. Sarah was inside, setting out salt and pepper shakers. She looked up when he entered, and her eyes widened in alarm. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll be looking for you." "They know where I am," Reacher said, taking the same stool as before. "What I want to know is why they were so interested in Frank." He leaned forward slightly. "You knew him, Sarah. Don't lie to me again. I'm not the one you should be afraid of." Tears welled in her eyes. She bit her lip, looking around the empty diner as if the walls were listening. "Frank was a good man," she said, her voice barely audible. "He was different from the others who worked for Caldwell." "Different how?" "He was kind. He talked to people. He noticed things." She took a shaky breath. "My brother, David, he went to work for Caldwell Security 6 months ago. He was so proud. Good pay, good benefits. A month later, he was gone. They told us he just packed up and left, that he stole some equipment. But David wouldn't do that. He wouldn't leave without a word." "Frank was looking into it," Reacher guessed. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He promised me he would. He said something wasn't right at the compound. He said they were doing more than just security training. He was scared, but he was determined to find out what happened to David and the others." "Others?" "There are stories," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Young men from out of town, hired for special projects. They come, they work for a few months, and then they disappear. The town pretends not to notice. Everyone who works for Caldwell gets paid well enough to keep their mouths shut. So that was it." Frank had uncovered the real business of Caldwell Security. It wasn't protection, it was something far darker. The disappearing men weren't just leaving, they were being disposed of. Frank, a man with a conscience, couldn't let it go, and it had gotten him killed. "Did he tell you anything else? Give you anything?" Reacher asked. She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "He told me if anything happened to him, there was a package for me. Hidden. He said it was his insurance policy." She scribbled something on a napkin and slid it across the counter. It was an address, a post office box in a town 50 miles away. "The key is in his old apartment. Number 4, above the hardware store. But Brody sealed it off after the accident." "A seal isn't a wall," Reacher said. He stood up. "Thank you, Sarah. Stay safe. Don't let anyone know you spoke to me." She just nodded, her face a mask of fear and hope. Getting into Frank's apartment was simple. The police tape was a suggestion, not a barrier. The lock on the door was cheap. Reacher was inside in under a minute. The apartment was small and sparse, much like Reacher's own non-existent homes. It had been tossed, not professionally, but thoroughly. Drawers were pulled out, the mattress was sliced open, floorboards were pried up. They had been looking for something, the insurance policy, but they hadn't found it. Frank had been smarter than that. Reacher didn't look for a conventional hiding place. He thought like a soldier. Frank would have used camouflage, hiding something in plain sight. He scanned the room. A bookshelf with a few paperbacks, a small kitchen, a closet. Nothing. Then he saw the heating vent on the wall near the floor. The grate was held in by 2 screws. One screw was shiny, new. The other was old and painted over. Reacher used his pocket knife to unscrew them. He pulled the grate off. Taped to the inside of the metal ductwork was a small, heavy envelope. Inside were 2 items, a key to a post office box and a single sheet of paper. On the paper was a list of names, dates, and serial numbers. The names were unfamiliar, but the serial numbers belonged to high-grade military hardware, explosives, assault rifles, night vision gear, the kind of equipment you don't use for guarding a shopping mall. He had Frank's insurance policy. Now he just had to figure out how to cash it in. He needed a vehicle. Walking 50 miles wasn't an option, not with Caldwell's men likely looking for him. He found a used car lot on the edge of town. It was run by a greasy man who looked at Reacher like he was a sack of money with legs. Reacher paid cash for a 15-year-old pickup truck that looked like it had survived a war. The engine coughed and sputtered, but it ran. That was all that mattered. He was 10 miles out of Harmony Creek when he noticed the black SUV in his rearview mirror. It had been there for the last 2 miles, keeping a steady distance. They were following him. He had 2 options. Try to outrun them on the open road or deal with them now. He chose now. He saw a turnoff ahead, a dirt track that led into a rocky, wooded area. He wrenched the wheel, the old truck groaning as it bounced off the highway and onto the rugged path. The SUV followed without hesitation. Reacher drove for another half-mile, kicking up a cloud of dust, then slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt behind a large rock outcropping that hid him from the main road. He killed the engine, grabbed the tire iron from under the seat, and got out. He moved quickly, circling around the rocks, using the terrain for cover. He heard the SUV stop, the engine cutting out. 2 doors slammed. "He's in here somewhere. Find him!" a voice shouted. It was one of the men from the bar, the one whose knee Reacher had broken. He sounded angry and in pain. He must have been in the passenger seat. Reacher stayed low, moving silently through the scrub brush. He saw them. There were 4 of them, spreading out. The injured man was leaning against the SUV, directing traffic. The other 3 were armed with handguns, moving cautiously into the trees. They were professionals, but they were in his world now. He waited. He let them pass his position. Then he moved. He came up behind the last man in the line. The man was focused on the woods in front of him, his gun held at the ready. Reacher didn't make a sound. He swung the tire iron in a short, brutal arc, connecting with the back of the man's skull. The man dropped without a sound. 1 down. The other 2 heard the muffled thud. "What was that?" one called out. "Stay sharp," the other replied. Reacher didn't give them time to regroup. He burst from the trees, closing the distance in a few long strides. The closest man turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He tried to bring his gun up, but Reacher was too fast. He lunged, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him to the ground. The gun flew from his hand. Reacher delivered a single, precise punch to the man's temple. He went limp. 2 down. The last man standing fired a shot. The bullet whizzed past Reacher's head, close enough for him to feel the air move. Reacher dropped and rolled, coming up behind the cover of a thick pine tree. "Come on out, you son of a bitch!" the man yelled, his voice tight with panic. He fired 2 more shots into the trees. Reacher picked up a rock, the size of his fist. He waited for a pause in the shooting. Then, he threw the rock hard into the bushes about 20 feet to his left. The man spun and fired at the sound. It was the opening Reacher needed. He sprinted from behind his tree, a silent, charging shadow. The man heard him too late. He tried to turn, to bring his weapon to bear, but Reacher was on him. He didn't use the tire iron. He didn't need to. His hands were enough. It was over in seconds. 3 down. Reacher walked back toward the dirt track. The injured man was still leaning against the SUV, his face pale. When he saw Reacher emerge from the woods alone, his bravado vanished, replaced by pure terror. "Who the hell are you?" he stammered. "I'm Frank's friend," Reacher said, his voice a low growl. "And I'm your worst nightmare." He walked up to the man, who flinched, expecting a blow. But Reacher just looked at him with cold, dispassionate eyes. "I want you to go back to Elias Caldwell. I want you to tell him what happened here. Tell him I have Frank's list. Tell him I'm coming for him. And tell him that for every man he sends after me, I'm going to take 10 of his. Are we clear?" The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. "Good," Reacher said. "Now get out of here." He watched as the man struggled to get his 3 unconscious colleagues into the SUV. It was a pathetic sight. Finally, the man got behind the wheel and sped away, leaving a trail of dust and fear in his wake. Reacher stood alone in the quiet woods. The fight had been a necessary distraction. Now he could get back to the main objective. He walked back to his truck, tossed the tire iron into the passenger seat, and started the engine. He had a 50-mile drive, a post office box to open, and a war to win. The town of Laramie was 50 miles and a world away from Harmony Creek. It was bigger, busier, and nobody gave Reacher a second look. He found the post office, used the key from Frank's apartment, and opened the small metal box. Inside was a single, thick manila envelope. Reacher took it to his truck and tore it open. It wasn't just a list. It was everything. There was a ledger detailing illegal arms sales to paramilitary groups in South America. There were shipping manifests, bank statements showing wire transfers to offshore accounts, and photographs. Photos of Elias Caldwell meeting with known terrorists. Photos of the training compound showing men in unmarked uniforms practicing urban warfare tactics. And there were sworn affidavits from 2 former employees who had been silenced. One of them was Sarah's brother, David. He hadn't just disappeared. He'd been executed after refusing to participate in a training exercise that involved live targets. Frank had uncovered a private army for hire, a treasonous enterprise operating under the guise of a legitimate business. He had gathered the proof, and it had cost him his life. Reacher sat in the cab of his truck, the evidence spread across the seat next to him. This was bigger than avenging a friend. This was about stopping a man who was selling out his country for profit. The local sheriff was useless. The feds were too far away and would get bogged down in bureaucracy. Caldwell would bury the evidence and disappear. No, this had to be finished here, by him. He drove back towards Harmony Creek, but he didn't go into town. He found a secluded spot in the hills overlooking the valley where the Caldwell compound was located. From his vantage point, he could see it clearly. It was a fortress, a 10-foot-high fence topped with razor wire, guard towers at each corner, and armed patrols moving with military precision. Getting in would be suicide. But Reacher wasn't planning on knocking on the front door. He needed a plan. He studied the compound for hours, watching the patrol patterns, the shift changes, the delivery trucks coming and going. He had Frank's evidence, but he needed to do 2 things: get it out to the world and dismantle Caldwell's operation permanently. His plan began to form. It was audacious, reckless, and had 1,000 ways it could go wrong. It was perfect. First, he needed a distraction. A big one. He drove to the nearest town with a real hardware store and bought several gallons of gasoline, fertilizer, and a few other household chemicals. He spent the afternoon in the woods, building several large, timed incendiary devices. They were crude, but they would be effective. Second, he needed a way in. The main gate was impossible. The fence was electrified, but there was a weakness. A drainage culvert that ran under the fence on the north side of the compound. It was narrow and probably graded, but it was a potential entry point. Third, he needed to get the evidence out. He went back to Laramie and found a 24-hour copy shop. He spent 2 hours duplicating every single document and photograph in Frank's package. He put one complete set into a large envelope, addressed it to a trusted journalist he knew from his army days, and dropped it in a mailbox. The second set he kept with him. The originals he placed back in the manila envelope. That night, under the cover of darkness, he put his plan into motion. He placed his incendiary devices at strategic points in the woods surrounding the compound, setting the timers for 3 a.m. Then he made his way to the drainage culvert. The grate was heavy steel, bolted into the concrete. He had brought the tire iron for a reason. It took him 20 minutes of silent, straining effort, but finally, the bolts groaned and gave way. He slid the grate aside and crawled into the dark, narrow pipe. It was a tight squeeze and the smell was foul, but he emerged on the other side, inside the fortress. He was in. He moved silently along the shadows of the buildings, his senses on high alert. He was a ghost in the enemy's camp. He knew from Frank's notes where Caldwell's office was, the top floor of the Central Administration Building. That was his target. At precisely 3 a.m., the woods erupted in fire. His devices worked perfectly, creating a massive blaze on the eastern perimeter of the compound. Alarms blared, men shouted, floodlights swept across the grounds. The entire force of the compound was drawn to the fire, a diversion they couldn't ignore. In the ensuing chaos, Reacher slipped into the administration building. The corridors were empty. He took the stairs, 2 at a time, until he reached the top floor. Caldwell's office was locked, of course, a solid oak door with a sophisticated electronic lock. Reacher looked at the hinges. They were external. Amateurs. He wedged the tip of the tire iron into the gap and put his full weight on it. The wood splintered. The metal shrieked. The door burst open. The office was lavish. A large mahogany desk, leather chairs, a panoramic window overlooking the burning chaos he had created. And sitting behind the desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, was Elias Caldwell. He was an older man with silver hair and cold, intelligent eyes. He didn't look surprised to see Reacher. "I've been expecting you," Caldwell said, his voice calm. "Frank's friend. You've caused me a great deal of trouble." "You haven't seen trouble yet," Reacher said, tossing the original envelope of evidence onto the desk. "This is what you killed him for. It's over, Caldwell." Caldwell glanced at the envelope, then back at Reacher. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "You think that package matters? You think you're the first person to try and expose me? This is my world. I own the law here. I own the people. By the time anyone with any real power sees that, I'll be gone, and you'll be another hunting accident." From the shadows in the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was the man from the bar, the one with the scar. He held a silenced pistol, aimed squarely at Reacher's chest. "You're a formidable man, Reacher," Caldwell continued. "I'll give you that, but you're still just one man. I have an army." "Your army is busy putting out a fire," Reacher said, "and you made a mistake. You assumed I came here to kill you." He looked at the man with the gun. "He's going to shoot me. Then you're going to burn this evidence, and you're going to walk away. That's your plan, right?" Caldwell nodded. "Something like that." "Wrong plan," Reacher said. He looked past Caldwell, out the large window. A small red light was blinking on the roof of the opposite building. A security camera. It was aimed directly at the window. "What you didn't know about Frank," Reacher said, his voice low, "is that he was a genius with electronics. He told me about your security system. He told me how to access it." Reacher pulled a small device from his pocket, a modified cell phone. "This camera, it's not recording, it's broadcasting, live, to a server that a friend of mine at the NSA is already tracking. Everything you've said, everything you're about to do. The world is watching, Elias." Caldwell's composure finally cracked. His face went pale. He looked at the camera, then back at Reacher. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Reacher asked. Frank's insurance policy wasn't just paper, it was digital too. The man with the scar hesitated, his eyes darting between Reacher and his boss. In that moment of hesitation, Reacher moved. He threw the heavy tire iron with a powerful underhand toss. It spun through the air, crashing into the gunman's wrist. Bones snapped. The gun clattered to the floor. Reacher was on him in an instant, a brutal series of blows that left the man unconscious on the expensive rug. Caldwell scrambled for a drawer in his desk, pulling out a heavy revolver. But Reacher was already there, vaulting over the desk. He grabbed Caldwell's wrist, twisting it until the gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling. He slammed the old man back into his chair. "It's over," Reacher said, his face inches from Caldwell's. Sirens wailed in the distance. Real sirens. Not the compound's alarms, but the sound of state and federal law enforcement. The live stream, or maybe the journalist he'd mailed the package to, had worked faster than he'd anticipated. Caldwell looked defeated. The cold confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning horror of a man whose empire was crumbling around him. "They took my friend," Reacher said, his voice a quiet storm. "So I took everything back. Your business, your army, your future." He left Caldwell sitting there, a broken man in a burning kingdom. He walked out of the office, down the stairs, and melted back into the chaos of the compound. By the time the first federal agents breached the gate, Reacher was gone. He slipped back through the drainage culvert and disappeared into the night. He walked for miles until the glow of the fires and the sound of the sirens were just a memory. At dawn, he reached the highway. He didn't look back. Harmony Creek would heal. The families of the missing men would get answers, if not peace. Justice, in its own messy, violent way, had been served. Frank Peterson had been avenged. A bus appeared on the horizon, heading east. Reacher raised his hand. It slowed to a stop, the doors hissing open. "Where are you headed?" the driver asked. Reacher stepped up, a solitary, anonymous figure against the rising sun. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Just forward." The doors closed, and the bus pulled away, carrying him back to the open road, leaving nothing behind but a ghost story and the wreckage of a corrupt man's world.